All right, so as an introduction, Regional Economic Modeling Incorporated has been around since 1980, and our motivation is to provide tools to policymakers so that they can see the impacts of the policies that they're considering before the policy is implemented. And so at the heart of what we do is trying to improve public policy. And our belief is that if you're able to analyze and you're able to gather more information about what the future might hold, then you'll have a more refined decision-making process. We're able to do that with folks all across the spectrum in terms of different sectors of the economy and of society. We're able to work with government leaders, private sector leaders, those in academia, et cetera. And again, anybody that's working with the macro economy is likely somebody that we can help. And again, just to continue this introduction, we're able to provide that help throughout the country. We're not, our models are able to take a look at what's going on in the states and counties all throughout the United States. All right. Now let's take a quick look at the current housing market. There's a few key data points that motivate some of the analysis that we do today. Taking a look at housing prices in March 2021 and comparing them to 1 year before, so March 2020, there was a 13.3% increase in the housing price index from between that time period. And if you make the same comparison in April, you're looking at nearly 15% increase in the price of housing. To give a little bit of context, if we take a look at that same metric, same month analysis, but the year before, from 2012 to 2020, then we see an average of 6% increase in the price of housing. And you can really tell that in the last few months, housing prices have seen a really significant uptick. If you take a look at that graph to the right, we have a rather steady increase, that 6% average increase from the trough of the Great Recession to about 2020. But if you squint your eyes a little bit towards the right, you can see that the slope of that line increases significantly just in the last few quarters. All right, now the analysis that we're doing today will focus on Washington State, and so we wanted to share some of the same metrics for that state as well. If you're comparing the Seattle and Tacoma counties from January 2020 to January 2021, you see a 23% growth. So even higher than the national average. And then this is a distinction that we'll explain here in just a couple of slides, but the next 10 moderately growing counties, by Washington standards at least, saw a 15% growth in the last year as well. So we have a nation with rapidly increasing housing prices, and Washington State specifically is even more so increasing at a very rapid rate. On this graph to the right, you can see that, again, after the trough at about 2012, then the housing price trajectory is just much higher for Washington State than for the rest of the United States. And even the Seattle area beats out the Washington average quite significantly. All right. Now, what does this mean for economic modeling? Why would we want to model what's going on in the past year out into the future? Well, what's interesting about what's this past year in the housing market is this really steep increase in the price of housing has correlated with an economic recession, something that is not typical, certainly not typical of the 2008 recession. And so this is kind of a new scenario that I think may warrant a closer look. There's questions as to how this will impact the economic recovery from the COVID-19 recession. There's questions about how this will impact industries or whether this could be large enough to cause recessions in certain states. And also on the labor force side, there are questions as to who this will impact. Will it impact minorities more than other demographics? How will it impact rural communities, urban communities? And so because this increase in the housing price index nationwide and in Washington is a little unique given the economic context in which we've seen it, there are some special questions. And what we can do with the REMI model is see given certain parameters, how will the economy be affected by this phenomenon? All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the demo. Before I open up the model, I just wanted to describe some of the methodology we used in the analysis. So we've taken a 39 region model of Washington. That's the state split it into each of its counties, and we've grouped the counties into 4 categories. Now we make this grouping using 2 different metrics. One is the percentage growth of housing prices from January 2012 to January 2021. We use Zillow.com data to make this analysis. We also analyze the dollar amount, the level amount that housing prices average housing prices have gone up in each county over that time period. We compare both of these metrics because for a low price county, if you have a moderate increase in dollar terms, that might show up as a really high percentage increase to the dollar to the average housing price. And on the flip side, if you have a housing market for say San Juan County in Washington that is already averaging around $650,000 to $700,000 for a home, then large dollar amounts don't actually convert into large percentage increases in the price of housing. So we compare both of these metrics to kind of balance out those 2 phenomenons and to see where housing price growth is occurring in the state. And so what was interesting is that for 4 counties, Clark, King, Pierce, and Snohomish, they were top 4 in both terms, meaning that in percentage terms, the housing price is increasing very rapidly, but also by a dollar amount, they're also increasing by large strides. This was not necessarily the case with the other categories. Usually one was strong or like high ranking in one metric, but lower ranking in the other. But it's based on that analysis, it was quite clear that these 4 counties were seeing the bulk of the housing price increase in Washington. I won't spend a whole lot of time on the methodology of how we break down the rest of those counties. If there are further questions, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A portion. But the important thing here is that we have these 4 categories, and we designate these categories using those 2 metrics, and they're ordered from highest price growth in housing to lowest. Great, and this is a map of how that aggregation kind of plays out in the state. So you can see that in the Seattle, Tacoma area, those highest price growth, this green section right here, you see the highest amount of growth. Clark County in the south is where Vancouver, Washington is, and then that moderate growth kind of hugs those areas. Spokane is off to the east here, and so that's a larger metropolitan area that's seeing healthy growth. But then the lower price and the lowest priced categories tend to be on the periphery away from that urban core. All right. Now, the variables that we look at, I've displayed here. So if you can remember back to those data points we saw a few slides ago, those 4 counties increased by upwards of 23% in the past year. So what we do in the model is we simulate a persistent impact on housing prices, so that in the next year, in 2022, housing prices are 10% above the baseline, and that tapers to 0% above the baseline by 2040. The model in that baseline has a few percentage points increase in housing prices, and so this replicates a large shock to housing prices in 2020, which we've already recorded, but then also a lasting effect that continues over time. And then in that second category of moderately growing counties in terms of housing prices, we do a moderate growth above the baseline, so 5% above the baseline. And this percentage is in the residential real estate price. All right. Okay, and just before I open up the model, I wanted to give some context for the model that I'm using. I'm using a PI Plus model, which is our flagship model. We use We use public data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from the Census Bureau, a few other organizations to inform the variables here in the model. And this table to the right shows the linkages that are housed within the model. So what we will be manipulating are housing prices in that bottom left corner, and you can see that housing prices in the model impact consumer prices, which then impact real compensation rates, which then goes on to impact a variety of factors, things like population, things like government spending. And so what we're able to see with the model is we provide this change, we input this change into the housing price, and then it begins to ripple through the economy, and we're able to see how it affects different industries and different demographics. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and drop the slide and transition over to the model itself. This is the landing page of the model. You can see we're using a Washington state model, and if I open up the regional profile, I can see that this model is treating every county as its own region. The graph or the map that you saw a few slides ago was a custom aggregation that I built into the model. This is something that any user is able to do, is to aggregate the geographies within the model to their desire, and so I've done that custom aggregation. When we create a new scenario, we click this new regional simulation button. I've already prepared a regional simulation, so I'll go ahead and toggle to that now. We're able to switch and look at a lot of different variables. I'm not going to go into all the different variables that are possible within the model. I'll just focus on the ones that I've input today. So it looks like we have, great, so we've got these two categories, as I mentioned. We've got highest growth counties and moderately growing counties. You can see that I've manipulated the real estate price in those 4 regions. So you have the counties that are being impacted there. And then in this moderate growth, we have those regions, those counties that are considered that moderate growth in the state. And you can see that I've increased these high growth counties by 10%, moderate growth counties by 5%, and that they start to decline and they come to 0 if I scroll down to the end of the time period to 2040. They go back down to 0. All right. And just to clarify, this represents a percentage increase above the baseline that is already input into the model. All right, and before I forget, it looks like I'm low on battery, so I'm gonna grab my power cord. Apologize for that. Okay. All right, so we go to forecast options. You can see that I've done this forecast out to 2040. I've already run the forecast. It takes a second to do all the calculations, so I've done that beforehand. We go to the results. I won't share all the results on this page. There's a lot to comb through. I have a few results that I thought were notable that I've pulled out and exported. Any result you see, you can export in either a table form or a graph form. But we'll just go over some key points before I go back to the slide deck. So you can see that in this scenario, there's not a whole lot of economic joy going on here. We have loss in employment, we have loss in population, we have loss in GDP and output, and real disposable income. And this is probably not very surprising. If we're increasing the price of housing, then that's going to shift the way people are able to spend their money, and that's going to draw employment away from other sectors of the economy. This is sometimes difficult to draw trends from in a table form. So if I just come over here and pull up a graph, I'll just switch it to a line graph form just so it's easier to pull information out. Let's see if this will come up. Just take, yep, okay. All right. You can see there's some pretty dramatic changes. Now this isn't just differences, it's a little difficult to compare different metrics like GDP and population in absolute terms. And so if we switch to GDP change, or sorry, percentage change, then we start to see quite a clear picture. So GDP, we're losing about 15 points below the baseline. And this is not an accumulative number. This is not every year another 15 points being taken off. This is every year it's 15 points below that baseline. So you can see not a whole lot of things to cheer about economically speaking. If we look and you know, if we had the time, we could take a look at some of these further breakdowns. I have pulled out some of these analyses in the slide deck. But before we go back to that, we'll point out some of the DEI indicators as well. DEI standing for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can take a look at how this is impacting the economy from a societal perspective. And so let's take a look at perhaps employment by education. We can see if we go to detailed education groups that the job losses, if you can see in this group, job losses are mostly among those that have less than a high school degree, or not quite a college degree. And so this shock is impacting those demographics quite substantially. Now at this point, I'm going to toggle back to the slide deck to kind of go over some of the results that we saw. Let's see, this is going to bring me back to the front page, but I'll go ahead and come back to the page we were on. Okay. All right. So these are all graphs that I pulled from the model itself. And so first, let's take a look at employment by region. We have these 4 categories: those highest priced growth counties, moderate, lower, and lowest. You can see statewide, all combined, we're expecting employment to be about 10,000 jobs below the baseline by the middle of this time period, by about 2030, between 2030 and 2034. Just to provide some additional context, in April of 2020, when the pandemic really started impacting the economy, 396,000 jobs were lost in Washington in that month. And from May last year to May this year, there's been an average of 19,000 jobs gained per month. And so in the last year, we've seen about 200,000 jobs gained over the course of the year. So this kind of metric, 10,000 jobs lost, is likely not enough to bring the country or bring the state into negative job terms. Importantly, however, those strong job gain numbers between May of last year and May of this year could be just a bounce back effect from the recession. And so it's possible that in the future that these numbers start to come closer together, and you can really see that the employment loss could become a drag on the economy. Something that I think is interesting is that the highest price growth counties lose far more jobs proportionally than those moderate price growth counties. If you can remember, we increased the highest category by 10% above the baseline, and the moderate section is 5% above the baseline. So there's a 2-to-1 ratio there. However, the employment loss is not 2-to-1. Highest price growth counties lose far more jobs proportionally than moderate priced counties. There's a few reasons why this might be. Perhaps there's outmigration from those highest priced counties, and they're moving to the moderate price counties. That will dampen that employment loss. But it's interesting that the dynamics between regions is not straightforward, that there are some interlinkages going on that give us some interesting results. Now, if we take that same job loss and take a look at it by industry, we learn additionally some interesting things. So you can see there's some distribution for job losses in the state. For example, construction and retail and wholesale take a hit. What's interesting is that services industry, that gray bar in the middle, takes by far the largest hit in employment. But services is kind of like a broad topic. It'd be helpful to be able to break this down further. And so I took data from the model and was able to break down the services sector into its component parts. And we learned some additional information and some additional insights into how we might view this phenomenon going on in the economy, the high housing price increases. So you can see that, again, there's somewhat of an even distribution in job losses, but there are some key industries that are losing out quite significantly. So you can see that food services and drinking places lose the most. Again, it's probably intuitive. If a household is constrained on their mortgage payments, then it's likely that they'll start to reduce consumption, reduce eating out, etc. But they also reduce their consumption of of hospital use. There's less employment in the hospital sector, in the education services sector, and in other like services to households. And this has two important implications. The first is that these are industries that typically employ low-wage earners. Certainly the case in the food services industry. Hospitals and healthcare is a little bit less so, but there are some very important entry-level jobs, thinking nursing assistants, nurses assistants, or surgical technicians that are, these are not individuals with college degrees. These are entry-level and somewhat low-income jobs, and so these industries taking a hit in employment shows that this could be hurting that low-income sector of society. An additional important point here is that if households are constrained on their payments because of their high mortgages, then it's likely, it appears, that they then spend less on important services, things like healthcare, things like education, and that's not an outcome that any policymaker is probably shooting for. They're probably that's spending that we want to be able to see. All right, now taking a look at income inequality, very simply, that income inequality increases. Again, probably not a very earth-shattering earth-shattering revelation, but what's important here is that we can quantify the level to which the economy is becoming more unequal. This is a Gini coefficient, percentage increase on that Gini coefficient. And what's also interesting here is that these lower priced counties actually see a reduction in that income inequality. That might be because high wage earners in high and medium and wage earners in the highest price counties are leaving and moving to those more rural and less high cost housing communities. And so that might be balancing some of the income inequality there. All right, if we take a look at employment by race, we also find something that's, I think, important for policymakers to understand. This is a percentage change in employment broken down by race, and you can see that the Black non-Hispanic population loses the most by quite a substantial amount in employment. If you look at the levels, like just the straight number of jobs that are lost, the white and non-Hispanic population loses the lion's share of jobs in the economy. But that's probably not very surprising for a state that's about 70–75% white demographically. But when we look at the percentage change perspective, then we can see that Black Hispanic population is losing out quite significantly. All right, and lastly, we can see compensation by income quintile, and this is also probably not an outcome that is very desirable for policymakers. So you can see that the highest 20% is seeing some compensation rate gain. There is upward pressure on wages as people leave the state, and as housing prices increase, there's a slight upward pressure on wages. But most of that is captured by those that are already the highest 20% earners in the community. Those that are in the middle, the second, middle, and fourth quintiles of earners see some gains. It's a little bit more muted, but that generally there's some gains there. But interestingly, the lowest 20% of wage earners actually see wage depression. Their wages go down at the beginning and the end of this time period, and only there's only moderate gains, barely above zero in the middle time period. And so again, we can see that as housing prices increase, we can see where that income inequality is coming in. It's really impacting the employment of those that are lower income. All right, now let's draw some conclusions and we'll have some time for Q&A. All right. So just a few notable results. One, on that first slide with the job losses by region, we do see that muted job loss in those less dense counties. There could be a few reasons for that, but I think it's interesting to show that the interconnections of those counties are important. There's probably some migration effects going on there, but there's not a strict one-to-one relationship between an increase in the housing cost and loss in employment. There's geographic and dynamic effects that are going on there. Also interesting is that income inequality is amplified, that this impacts low income and minority populations quite significantly. And also there's evidence that as housing prices increase, households spend less money on really important goods and services, things like healthcare and education. Now, none of these results are probably very earth-shattering. I think we all kind of intuitively understand that housing price increases is bad for the economy, certainly bad for low income and for low wage earners. But the power of this model is we're able to quantify exactly by how much these demographics are impacted. This can be really helpful to try to gauge different services or maybe competing policies. This could be really helpful to understand how a policy to reverse that trend might impact the economy as well. And so how could this information, how could this analysis be applied? This could be helpful for a metropolitan planning organization if they're trying to understand how housing price increases might change demographic shifts, which might have implications for transportation infrastructure, or if they're planning job centers or bus routes, etc. This could be important information to understand who's being helped and hurt in this economy. It also could have really strong implications for economic development. If leaders are trying to revitalize urban centers, they might have more information now on how households are hurting and in which sectors of society are being impacted the most. And of course, for job creation programs, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, what the power of this model does is it helps clarify some of those happenings in the economy, but it also is able to quantify. And that is kind of the crux of what the model does. This model is helpful because it not only clarifies what's going on and visually helps you see the linkages of different sectors in the economy, but it allows you to quantify exactly how much things are increasing or decreasing. This helps you avoid unwanted negative impacts. It might, show some impacts that weren't necessarily anticipated. And the model is also able to show you're also able to take the data and the graphs from the model and use it as a way to inform others, whether it be state legislators or other stakeholders. All of the data is something you can publish from the model and share. That concludes my presentation today.